I basically the reason I think that I was kind of invited is that I have spoken quite a bit about a lot of similar topics to kind of what somehow related to current events that are happening in US politics. For yeah, for better or for worse, it's kind of a really interesting for me that something that I was kind of, a little bit, I wouldn't say obsessive over, but kind of very keeping up with a lot, but then feeling that for a long time it was still something that's quite niche and strange to be into. And then all of a sudden being thrust into a situation where now everybody is talking about these various things that I've been kind of researching and exploring. Um, so the reason I've kind of come upon this space is that I've been working in the cryptocurrency space for maybe about 5-ish years. And I kind of got into it in part because I started a podcast and a blog called Blockchain Socialist, where I was interested in exploring kind of both a critique and just an understanding of the technology from a more progressive point of view. And in that process, got kind of like more embedded in the crypto space, got to meet a lot of different people, plenty of people who are not kind of necessarily, you know, similar in my thinking as far as politics goes. But met a lot of like pretty interesting people at the very least. I've been to just like a lot of different types of crypto conferences. They happen all over the world. There's a constant kind of circuit going on. I've spoken at many of these, and as well because of the podcast and the blog, I wrote a book called Blockchain Radicals, where I've kind of analyzed the crypto space from a left-wing point of view, both again a critique and kind of exploration of what is interesting in it. Um, and a thing to know about the crypto space, in case you don't know, cryptocurrency, so things like Bitcoin, you may have heard of, or Ethereum, are kind of like the two biggest ones. They attract generally a more, say, right-leaning politically like crowd. It tends to be the types of people who are interested in libertarian economics. And part of the reason is because a lot of the kind of first people or the people who were kind of creating Bitcoin and so forth were themselves libertarians from like kind of conservative libertarianism. Libertarian in particular, kind of like free market fundamentalism. So they believed that free markets or the private market, as opposed to the state and public services, was meant to be, it should be kind of like the main, if not the only way in which people interact with each other in a kind of like larger scale as a society. Um, and so in the crypto space, I think the thing that kind of like has brought me closer to kind of the things that we're going to be talking about today with Doge and the philosophy that undergirds Doge, or the Department of Government Efficiency, is kind of my work into explorations um, of Balaji Srinivasan's concept, the network state. So Balaji Srinivasan is a Indian American venture capitalist. He made a lot of his money by selling businesses in Silicon Valley. He studied at Stanford, got a PhD in Stanford, was very much a kind of Silicon Valley idealist to the point to where in 2013 he did a talk in front of Y Combinator. Y Combinator being kind of kind of like an accelerator program for a lot of the kind of like top startups in the US. So Airbnb went through Y Combinator, probably several others that I'm forgetting. But it's a very prestigious kind of thing if you're part of that world. He spoke there in 2013, arguing for what he called Silicon Valley's ultimate exit. So he argued that Silicon Valley should separate itself from the United States as its own polity. that is free from the US's kind of regulatory bodies. In part, this comes from, I believe, most likely his experience of his first startup, which was a genomics company. So they did genetic testing. And of course, when you do that type of work, you have to deal with the FDA. The FDA has to approve, various types of treatments before it can go into the market. And this is something that I guess he found very, very uh, difficult to deal with, and has since then been on a kind of like tirade of being very anti-FDA. He was kind of floated as being the head of the FDA in Trump's first term. So it was kind of like, I think there was a moment where they were testing the waters, or what if Balaji became head of the FDA, a guy who wants to abolish the FDA. Um, so that didn't happen. Of course, he didn't become the head of the FDA. I'm sure there are internal politics within the right as to why that didn't happen. Um, but he has, so just to say that he has kind of like plenty of connections with the right wing in the US, kind of historically. And so just to kind of continue from that, in 2021 or 22, I want to say, he published a book called The Network State. And the network state, which you may or may not have heard of, it kind of gets thrown around in a lot of reporting around similar things, is this idea of basically um, turning online communities into their own sovereign state, this own polity. Basically, similar to the idea that I mentioned before, where he argued in 2013, let's make Silicon Valley its own state that is separate from American regulation. He is saying, kind of made a larger manifesto about how we can uh, come together, first starting as online communities, and then leveling up in a way that we can start our own countries that sort of compete with existing countries. And these countries would be run effectively like a startup. So this is, I think, a very fundamental kind of thing to understand about a lot of these people, is that they believe that startups and kind of corporate organization is the kind of ideal of how humans should organize and ought to organize. That um, corporations are the most efficient, they are the most effective, they are the way that things should be run as for-profit entities generally. And so in my explorations of the network states, I read the book, I released a podcast with some collaborators and academics called Overthrowing the Network State. So actually, maybe I think I copied it in my, no, I did not. So I can post maybe just on my website the collection of these podcasts in this category. Um, Uh, so we ran this podcast series as a way to explore the ideas in the book. The reason we wanted to do this specifically, like as soon as it came out in 2021 or 2022, is because we knew at the time that it was going to become popular. The reason being is that um, Balaji Srinivasan is very popular in the crypto space generally. So people who are really into crypto, not all of them, probably majority of people don't necessarily know him, but a good chunk of people are really big believers in him, or really into like the things that he says. He manifests this air of like being able to make exponential predictions, that he can see something that's going to happen far away, like he is some not just an amazing businessman and investor, but also geopolitical analyst. He is very is very often that he will declare that, sometime soon there's going to be massive inflation in the United States, that like the dollar is going to collapse, and the only thing that's going to be there to survive anything will be Bitcoin. So he's this type of character, especially on Twitter, and he has been for quite a long time. Um, and so, being in the crypto space, I knew this was going to happen, and I knew we had to begin analyzing it and critiquing it because we knew he had already kind of described his idea well before the book came out, and we knew there was some bad stuff in it or things that kind of vehemently disagree with. And so, in that book, he cites fairly often Curtis Yarvin. Uh, so Curtis Yarvin, maybe you guys have heard of as well. He's kind of considered to be one of the philosophical fathers of the alt-right or the Dark Enlightenment. It's kind of a right-wing philosophy that is kind of this belief uh, of being against democracy quite strongly, that democracy is flawed and impossible, and that there needs to be kind of singular people to lead society and countries. And so he cites him quite a bit. And so what it effectively kind of does, I think, my kind of conclusion in part is that the network state is an attempt to kind of normalize a lot of the philosophy behind Curtis Yarvin, which is very, very crass. It's like very, very um, overtly edgy and racist um, in a way that is kind of like, you would be in disbelief when you read it. You're like, is this really something that this guy believes in? At least for most people. Um, it is, yeah, this guy's writing has been around since I believe like early 2010s or late 2000s, where he was blogging as his name was Mencius Moldbug. And in those writings, he would just kind of push the envelope to how kind of in many ways you could see it as like kind of how ridiculous can he go with a lot of the things that he was saying. Um, so yeah, I mean maybe I've talked a lot. Maybe I can pause right here. I have, I could share some slides of things that I've presented in the past, but um, yeah, maybe I'll take a pause to see what else is there that like people are interested in learning more about. Oh yeah.
Which
Um, you like that is one way to kind of frame it. So one of the so the network states by Balaji specifically cites a book by Curtis Yarvin called Patchwork. In Patchwork, Curtis Yarvin is describing a form of political kind of organizing or like a of like statecraft essentially uh, that he calls neocameralism. So cameralism is like an older kind of type of thought where basically it's about kind of like hyper centralization around the state as kind of it's kind of like a centralized technocracy you can think of. But in Patchwork, he is describing basically a desire for the return of the Holy Roman Empire, essentially, in that the Holy Roman Empire was not in itself like a coherent like singular entity, but it was a collection of like hundreds, if not thousands of fiefdoms that all came together in a patchwork, in which each one was centrally controlled by whoever was the lord of that specific place. They had their borders that they kind of monitored. Except now in Patchwork, he was advocating for basically Holy Roman Empire types of fiefdoms in which someone is a dictator of each of these little fiefdoms. And as someone who is not one of those dictators, you have a kind of free market of which essentially, which dictatorship do you want to live in? So he says it's all exit and no voice. So he says, democracy is basically a sham, and that what would be best is that everyone separates themselves into how exactly they want to live in their own little territories, and then, yeah, kind of just like choose the dictator you want to live under. So in that way, like Balaji is making the kind of like next conclusion or making again, although Curtis Yarvin says this as well, like each patchwork state is basically run like a company. So that's also a part of cameralism is like a corporate style of governance. So, you have a board of directors and you have a CEO, but the CEO is basically the monarch or the dictator, however you want to frame it. Um, and Balaji kind of says very, very similar, but in a less kind of edgy way, if that makes sense. Um, in Balaji's writing, there's more of a kind of like idealism in how he says it, whereas Curtis Yarvin is much more uh, straightforward that it's like kind of supposed to be authoritarian. Um, so yeah, I hope that answers kind of what you were getting at there. In a figure kind of funding plenty of right-wing movements for, I would say, a decade or two at this point. Um, this is kind of not necessarily new. It's just something that he's been kind of under the radar on, and he's like pretty good at not being too overt about it, at least in the start. Now he has become a lot more overt, I think, because Trump has come into office thanks to thanks to his supports. Um, but yeah, so Peter Thiel and Curtis Yarvin, there are clear connections between the two. They've definitely spoken to each other in a email that was kind of released in 2013, I want to say there was kind of like the quotes that is often cited in that is actually Balaji Srinivasan telling these people in this email list, which included Curtis Yarvin, Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen from A16Z, which was one of the largest venture capital firms, and plenty of like just tech entrepreneurs and investors. Um, Balaji was complaining, I believe it was about maybe the Black Lives Matter protests or something like that. Or no, it was about journalists just reporting on the things that they were discussing generally, and how to intimidate them. So he kind of says something along the lines of like, if a journalist starts coming after us, we can sick the dark enlightenment. Kind of says this to this entire email chain, and then that gets released to the press. Um, and so I think that, there is something to say about the similarities between being a king, being a monarch, and being a like billionaire or like, 100 millionaire in tech. They play kind of similar, they're like similarities between them. I mean, you could say this about not necessarily in tech, but just like a businessman and like the types of things that you have to do in order to get into the like upper echelons of business. Um, it's you have to make decisions that are dictatorial. And a big part of, I think, Peter Thiel's plan over the past couple of decades, which in like I'm kind of like of the belief that he has been planning this for a very long time, kind of slowly and patiently, influencing things towards a particular direction. Um, he does things like running accelerator programs like the Teal Fellowship, where a lot of kind of newer tech entrepreneurs go through. and then they will kind of like succeed or fail, or they will have this learning experience within the Teal Fellowship, in which Teal and many of his kind of associates will teach them basically how to run a startup and how to run a business. And a big part of his appeal for a lot of tech people is like the books that he's written about business and startups, like Zero to One is one of the famous ones, where he describes how, how to have your SaaS company, go from zero monthly recurring revenue to 1 million, recurring revenue. Um, and so yeah, this it's like like I can't describe to you like the A to B exactly what is the connection between them. Simply that there is this kind of amorphous blob of people who all intersect with very similar ideas. I would say both still. I mean, definitely I think it'll be more influential for those on the fence. Just because when someone is like so bought in, it's like hard to necessarily change their mind. Um, at least that's what I found in my experience. My kind of strategy is different depending on who I'm talking to, of course. Um, People who are fully bought in, who are maybe like trying to do one thing or another, my goal is mainly to just plant seeds into their mind so that whenever they eventually come across some sort of contradiction to their plan, because there are a lot of contradictions in the network state and how it's possibly done, they will remember these critiques, or they will have internalized these critiques in some way to help them kind of move beyond it sooner. And then for those who are on the fence, which I think is like the vast majority of people who go to network state-like events, it's kind of like oh, this sounds interesting. What is it? Because it sounds kind of like a subversive idea in some way for a lot of people. It's about, for me, just like laying out the path or the kind of logical conclusions of many of the ideas in that book. And so, yeah, I found that uh, the critiques that I made in the podcast and in my writing, they reached an audience mainly within the crypto space. Um, and I would like to think that a lot of that kind of slowed down the hype, especially of network states within the crypto space, because there was kind of plenty of like different initiatives that started right after the release of the book that arguably you can say was greatly kind of influenced by it, but um, did not, they luckily did not kind of go all in on the network state kind of roadmap, if that makes sense. Definitely. I mean, I think it's that the thing with conservatism, in particular in the US, there has been this kind of like overarching goal of removing Social Security. This has been like pretty overt for a lot of their donors, I think, for a long time. And the the problem that they're coming across, they have this contradiction of like one, it being, even if it's not like the most well-run, you know, type of organization, the amount of benefit that is gained from it is so large that they can't really deny it in a way that they like want to, I think. Just because the difference in, I believe it was like during the Great Depression, before and after Social Security was so profound. I mean, the level of, elderly poverty rates was huge before its existence. um, that I think and also they have the contradiction that there is like slightly more Republican voters of people who are older and are on Social Security as well. Um, so I mean so I think there is kind of like the political class of conservatives in the US are very unsure about necessarily fully going all in, but the philosophy behind uh kind of the creation of Doge, Elon Musk, Curtis Yarvin, who by the way, maybe interesting fact, Curtis Yarvin in I believe it was 2014 or so when asked, he had been for a long time saying we need like Americans need to get over their fear of dictatorship, essentially is what he said. And then kind of the person asks him, who do you think would be that dictator? And he says Elon Musk. This was quite a few years ago. But yeah, so like I think the people like Curtis Yarvin, people part of this dark enlightenment type of thinking, like full embrace of nihilism, would be like people who want to get rid of Social Security for sure. Um, and just like have people rely on the private market. And you could say argue that this is because like these are people who function purely in the private, or not really actually purely. I mean, they function largely in the private market, or they see themselves as, you know, largely private market actors. Um, so yeah, I don't know if that helps answer kind of your question. I think what is good about the Tesla protests at the moment is that it's like directly attacking it is in some ways a market targeted type of attack or like protest. Um, and I mean it's hard for me to say necessarily whether this is like really um hurting Elon Musk and his ability to direct, the Department of Government Efficiency or whatever. But I do think there is like a lot of value in that. I think there is like, um, you know, continuing that is really important. Um, it's hard for me to say what specifically can be done about the Dark Enlightenment just because it's so new as far as its influence, or like it's just like so abnormal in what it is and what it wants, and it really relies on like a level of uh say that like although there's plenty of Trump supporters, there are very few people who would be like bought into dark enlightenment thought, is my thinking at least. So I mean, the kind of other things that I can really say is like n- exposing like how weird these people are, I think is kind of maybe a big goal of this. I just think kind of like politically, strategically, people way underestimate how weird they are and how abnormal kind of the things that they believe in are, that if you just say them to people, they would be like, even if they are conservative, they would be really kind of freaked out by it or weirded out by it. Um, that's kind of like for me at least, the kind of one of the most effective things or moments for the Kamala campaign, I feel, was like Tim Walz whenever he was basically calling Republicans weird. For me, felt like a very effective kind of rhetorical tool at that moment. It's too bad they didn't really like continue with that because I thought it was working. Um, so I think there's something about this and how just like how completely strange they are. It is something that like, I never would have thought my weird kind of little corner of research that I was going into, of the weirdest people I've ever, read about, all of a sudden being influential in the White House. I mean, that was kind of, um, it was not on my bingo card, I can say. Uh, But yeah, generally, if you kind of describe, like, at least I found that even with crypto people who are supposed to be the most open and receptive to these ideas are still weirded out by it when you kind of break it down. And I think the kind of like the rhetorical trick that I use when communicating with people about this is to not try not to like freak out as you're telling them this. It's more like a casual kind of like like try to be a little bit more casual, like that's it's a weird thing, it's really weird, doesn't really make any sense. I find like as a way to get people to kind of not be open to those ideas at the very least. But as far as like pressuring for power and influence, um, I think there is sort of like a lot of kind of traditional work and organizing to be done around simply like being out there protesting, like making Tesla just like a no-go for people who don't want to be associated with the weirdness, um, and like pressuring Democrats because the types of things that you know in their like logical conclusion of what they want are so beyond the pale, that there has to be just like a tremendous amount of pressure to either kick out the old guard within the Democratic Party, who I feel have been completely failing, or just like pressuring them so much that they just like massively change their strategy. Um, and part of this, in my view at least, like to me, there needs to be a lot more Democrats who are not taking corporate money for their campaigns and such, because I think that is kind of like a major way that their kind of influence gets dulled towards any kind of progressive direction. That's kind of my view. Yeah, so this was like a presentation I gave a while back. This is my book, Blockchain Radicals, in case you're interested in um, understanding the technology part, at least. Um, and so, like, kind of part of what I was trying to convey to people, many of them who were kind of flirting with ideas of the network state. They may have not have read the book, but they watched a YouTube video about it that made it sound really cool. And because it was like an idea that was embracing cryptocurrency, they wanted to embrace it as well. Because if they believe in the like good of the technology, then they surely must believe in network states, is kind of um, the idea of it. And the reason kind of why people resonate with the network state, I found, is that for a lot of people, they find that whether they are on the left or the right, actually, institutions are failing to solve humans' most pressing problems. So in many ways, they see politics as not working. And when they mean politics, they mean like e- e- electoral politics specifically. So it's a great way to kind of um, then, as like Curtis Yarvin or Balaji Srinivasan say, democracy is not working. Look at the mess that we have. Um, when my counter to that would be that the institutions are not working because people like you, moneyed interests are kind of really, really influencing things in a negative way, to where they are suppressing democracy essentially and suppressing those institutions. So it's like you're you're making the institutions worse actively and then pointing at them and saying that they're not working. Um, but and then so like another kind of point I think for a lot of people who are into these ideas is since they like crypto and decentralized technology, they see them as essentially scaffolding for new institutions to replace the ones that are failing us at the moment, right? And so network states' embrace of this technology means that it is an embrace also of trying to fix institutions, which who doesn't want that in many ways? Um, it also the idea of a network state pulls a lot on people's desire and yearning for community. So I think more and more we're living in a kind of world where community is hard to find for a lot of people, in part because people have to work all the time. They don't have time to necessarily connect with people and a myriad of other types of issues we could probably point out. Um, and another point, like the fourth one, I think there's some sort of effect of people being able to connect with others over the internet in ways that they are not able to within their immediate vicinity or locality, in ways that maybe they want to. And so, in many ways, this has been good. The internet allows people with niche interests to come and form an online community together that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do in just their kind of local setting. And so combining these kind of, several different trends, I think people resonate with these ideas to some degree. This is just a little bit of proof of um, the presentation that I mentioned that Balaji Srinivasan gave to Y Combinator in 2013. One of his quotes, he says, but the best part is this, the people who think this is weird, the people who sneer at the frontier, who hate technology, they won't follow you out there. So it's kind of like this deep desire almost for a self-segregation from those who are holding us back to be in our own little community of tech entrepreneurs, presumably, to come together and make the most efficient and the best society you can possibly make in their eyes. And then he like kind of mentions a bunch of different other tech entrepreneurs who have made similar kinds of claims, including Larry Page from Google. He points at all the seasteading stuff by many libertarians, space exploration, and so forth. These are just like kind of more of some of the like ideas that really inspired network states as an idea and a concept. So patchwork was one which had a lot of influence, I would say. Um, there was the Dutch East Indies Company was is a big kind of influence in many ways. So the in case you didn't know, the Netherlands used to be run by a corporation. The corporation became stronger effectively than the monarchy for some time, um, and led to some pretty negative effects in the country. This was probably I want to say like 1700s, maybe more or less. So this is also peak kind of colonial exploration time, heavily influenced by charter cities, which is kind of like this idea of, cities that don't have certain regulations to promote innovation and whatever else. Um, he points to Hong Kong and Singapore as kind of examples of city-states that are super successful, super technologically advanced, and better than you know, uh, larger countries like the United States in some ways. Um, they're also very, corporate kind of countries. I was recently in Singapore. It's one of the most corporate countries I think I've ever been in my life. But yeah, for him, that is a good thing. And so in his book, he kind of has this 7 steps how to start a network state, and these are kind of the 7 steps. And these ones that are underlined are the kind of like steps of the process that I find very problematic. So he first says, found a startup society. So the startup society may not mean much to you, but in the book, he basically is describing a corporate framework. He's basically saying a society for startups, for companies to come and move. Organize it into a group capable of collective action. Okay, that's something that is uh, also, you guys are doing, organizing a group capable of collective action, like protesting Tesla, or protesting, at Tesla. Build trust offline and a crypto economy online. That's sort of basically him saying people should meet up physically after they've like made these online communities and use a cryptocurrency to facilitate an economy between them. It's kind of again, a lot of these things are very vague, just to say. Then he says crowdfund physical nodes. So he's basically saying buy property, crowdfund for property, and buy it up so that we have places to live to make part of our country. Digitally connect physical communities. Again, just meet up in person. Basically, conduct an on-chain census. So uh, that basically just means finding out how many people are in your country, how much money are they spending, so you can have a GDP of that country. And then the last one is gaining diplomatic recognition, or which basically in my eyes is kind of like neocolonialism or saying you're going to buy property in a country that already exists and then like try to secede from that country to gain diplomatic recognition is in many ways a kind of neo-colonial idea and process. But so yeah, in his book, he kind of has this Pokemon evolution essentially of going from a startup society to a network state or a kind of polity that has its own diplomatic recognition. Um, so those are kind of like some of the maybe in case like that idea pops up for you, um, that might be interesting. These are some quotes from Patchwork which are quite edgy. Who said if residents don't like their governments, they can and should move. The design is all exit, no voice. So no democracy. You simply leave your country if you don't like it. He has specifically a picture of the Holy Roman Empire at one point in which it's divided up in a bunch of tiny little fiefdoms as being the best way to kind of run a country. He's describing a sovereign corporation as a modified version of monarchy. The royal family is just a family business, and a patchwork realm is this basically public corporation and is like run like a joint stock company. Um, and so yeah, here are some like also some quite nasty things. Um, see, we can't find it again. Yeah, here's how should these be administered? A corporation, a sovereign corporation. And then here, he talks about San Francisco. What if we wanted to do something there? What do we do with all the homeless people? Well, we sell their slums out from under them. Obviously, demo everything, spray for roaches and rodents and pit bulls, smooth the rubble out with a bulldozer, a little aerial bombing, new residential districts suitable for Russian oligarchs. Next question. So it's kind of like you know, he's saying nasty, kind of edgy things, um, as a way to kind of get attention, but it's also something that, like, in many ways, we see it reflected in, the way that Trump is using ICE for taking, yeah, oftentimes legal immigrants in the United States and sending them to El Salvador and elsewhere. Um, Yeah, and then I wrote a review of the book back in 2023 in Outland magazine called Fork Your Society, I Want Out. And yeah, those are just some of the things I wanted to kind of touch upon for people so they have that knowledge. So build a cabal a bit. And their attitudes towards unhoused people are no different from our current government anyways. See the anti-homelessness laws around the country. Like that is something I would agree with for sure. In the eyes of like these people, they think that the government provides too much, of course. Like, I mean, we know the rhetoric coming from Trump and conservatives that, somehow illegal immigrants are getting housed in five-star resorts or whatever else. Um, and homeless people get everything they ever want all the time, and the problem is just that they're lazy or something. Um, but yeah, it's it's a way that they can continue the depravity.
All right, we're
Yeah,
at
I
the
know
end
we're
of
at.
the hour.
Yeah.
I don't know, your voice is probably tired from so much talking. And I realized that I skipped rather mercurial again, if you have any comments. Um,
All good, thanks.
all right, yeah, sorry about that. Um, is there anything else anybody wants to add, or if you consider your presentation over, Joshua, um, you can shill your book. I'll send everybody a link to it, don't worry. Um,
Yeah, of course. I appreciate everyone listening and humoring me. I know it's like it can sound kind of like if it sounds weird, the things that I'm saying or like the research that you're doing into this, it's because it is weird. And it is like almost intentionally esoteric, and meant not to be like well understood in a kind of like straightforward way.